Welcome back, everyone. Today we're stepping into a story that begins with an ordinary hike, but quickly unravels into something far more mysterious. Picture this: a dense forest, sunlight filtering through the trees, and then a discovery that defies explanation. Mike and Teresa thought they'd seen it all in their years of exploring nature, but nothing could have prepared them for what they stumbled upon at the heart of the woods. A tiny stone house, seemingly forgotten by time, surrounded by strange wires and whispers of secrets long buried. What they uncover will challenge everything they thought they knew, and leave you wondering what lies hidden just beyond the edge of the familiar. So settle in, because this is a journey you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. Mike and Teresa have no idea what they are dealing with when they encounter an old tiny stone house in the middle of a large forest. They can't find anything about it online, like nobody had ever seen this thing before. And while at first they are just confused by their discovery, when they look inside the house, they also become afraid. Mike and Teresa seem to be completely stumped by what they were seeing. Why was there a tiny stone house at the center of the forest? Judging by the looks of it, it had to have been there for decades. They slowly and carefully started to approach it. When they were getting closer and closer, they started hearing a strange noise, not in any way native to the forest. They quickly managed to determine that it was coming from inside the stone house. Teresa used a phone to shine some light into the house and figure out what was going on. Mike, you are not going to believe this. Mike saw her expression change as she slowly put her hand into the house, trying to get something out. But what had Teresa just found inside the tiny stone house? What was it even doing here in the first place, and why had nobody found it before? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. As frequent hikers, there wasn't much that surprised Mike or Teresa anymore. After 15 years of hiking together, they were experienced and confident in both their skills and their ability to manage whatever came their way. After all, they'd encountered some truly unbelievable things in the past and lived to tell the tale. They'd seen everything from homeless camps to wild animals in the most unlikely of places while out in nature. Once, the police had even gotten involved after Mike and Teresa alerted them to suspicious activity. But what they were about to find would easily top their list of strange sights forever. One Saturday afternoon, Mike and Teresa were getting ready for another hike in the preserve by their home. They had a usual routine, and they always used a checklist to make sure they didn't forget anything important. This time, they were planning on going deep into the forest, a trip that would take most of the remaining daylight hours. Their good friend Jonathan was joining them. When they'd mentioned their plans to head to the center of the forest, he'd seemed surprisingly interested in tagging along, even though he wasn't much of an outdoorsman. Mike and Teresa had no reason to doubt his intentions, so they were happy to have him. But there was more to Jonathan than he was letting on. When they arrived at the edge of the forest to meet up with Jonathan, the weather was perfect for late morning. The only downside was the looming shadow over the forest that made it seem a bit ominous. As they continued on into the darkened trees, the hike to the center of the forest wasn't friendly to beginners, but Mike and Teresa had more than enough experience. They watched out for Jonathan, who seemed to struggle with some of the steeper areas. Still, he was obviously determined. They'd barely seen any wildlife all day. Mike felt silly for not noticing it earlier. Normally, the preserve was full of small game like rabbits and squirrels. Even if they didn't see them directly, there was always some noise in the background. But that day, there were only a few birds circling in the sky. The other unusual thing is that none of the trails seemed to match up with their maps. But the markings and the paths in the actual forest were different. None of them seemed to go to the center of the preserve. Were they lost? Teresa suggested that maybe they weren't allowed to be in that part of the preserve, but neither of them had ever seen signs stating that. They tried to pull up a satellite view on their phones, but there wasn't any service in the more remote regions. Instead, Jonathan chose a trail and mentioned that maybe they'd find something soon. Mike and Teresa followed. Mike and Teresa decided to follow Jonathan and continue going in the same direction as before. As they walked deeper into the trees, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Finally, Teresa decided to pause and check their location again. She was able to get a weak signal on their tracker that indicated they were close to the center of the preserve. Happy that they'd been heading in the right direction after all, she didn't even stop to think about what they might find when they reached their final destination. When they arrived at the center of the forest, there was a surprising amount of open space with plenty of light streaming in through the canopy. Jonathan was visibly excited to get there and picked up the pace. But when Mike and Teresa stepped into the light, they realized that there was something else inside the clearing. Mike approached cautiously, wondering what he was seeing. Off in a shaded part of the field, he took a few steps closer and suddenly fell over. His foot tangled in something. Teresa hurried over to help him remove his boot and get free. When they looked up, Jonathan was gone. As Mike and Teresa searched for Jonathan, they noticed that there was a series of wires that seemed to go around the perimeter of the clearing. They were about shin height and looked like they were designed to make people trip. Feeling uneasy, they decided to follow the wires to see where they led. "Up ahead," said Mike, realizing that the structure he'd seen earlier was actually a small stone house. Based on the ivy, it looked like it had been there for decades. But why would anyone bother stringing wires around an abandoned home? Could the wires have been for a different purpose? Mike peered closer at the building. Maybe it wasn't abandoned at all. Suddenly, Jonathan emerged from the other side of the house. Like Mike and Teresa, he'd been trying to figure out what the wires were for. He showed them a part next to the house where there were even more wires at varying heights. Before they could figure out what to do next, they heard a bizarre noise coming from somewhere nearby. When they leaned closer, it almost sounded like ticking. The clearing made it difficult to find the source, but Teresa traced it to the back of the old house. It was clear that there was something or someone still inside. Mike was reluctant to go any closer in case it was a bomb, but Jonathan and Teresa couldn't resist their curiosity. Teresa found a short window on the ground floor where she could look inside. At first, all she could see was empty space. It was too dark to tell what was on the other side of the room. She took out her flashlight and held it up to the window for a better view. When she shone the light into the house, Teresa saw that there was a small box hooked up to the wires. It didn't seem dangerous, and she just had to know why someone had put a device so far out in the middle of nowhere. Jonathan was eager to help her open the tiny window, and she slowly reeled it in by the wires running under the sill. Teresa turned the box over in her hand and almost gasped as she showed it to Mike and Jonathan. There was an antenna mounted on the opposite side, and red lights were blinking urgently. Mike thought it was some kind of alarm designed to trigger whenever anyone entered the clearing. Somebody knew they were there. Teresa felt like they weren't safe. She wanted to get out of the forest immediately. Jonathan and Mike weren't that scared. They felt a lot of adrenaline. They wanted to get to the bottom of this. What could this mean? Why was this house so important to someone to place a device like this in it? Then Jonathan suddenly spotted something in one of the trees. He did not see what it was at first, but he had to get closer. Teresa begged them to leave it alone and just return to where they came from. Why was this so important to Mike and Jonathan? Then Jonathan saw what it was. It was a camera attached to the tree. Now they certainly knew somebody knew they were there, and they could even see them as well. This tiny house was certainly important to someone to keep an eye on. Was there something else inside of it? Teresa then heard something in the distance. She felt her heart stop for a moment. Who was approaching them? Teresa rushed to Mike and Jonathan, and she warned them. Someone was approaching. The two men were still investigating the tiny house. They couldn't find anything of value when they heard from Teresa that somebody was approaching. They did not want to stay. They wanted to return later. Without any hesitation, the group made a run for it. They couldn't risk waiting for someone to approach them. What if they had bad intentions? Jonathan took the device with him. He wanted to find out what it was. Then they heard someone shout in the distance. Teresa was now even more afraid. The device suddenly started making a sound again. Mike shouted to Jonathan to drop it. They could probably track the device. Jonathan was really stubborn. He did not want to get rid of it. Why was this so important to Jonathan that he couldn't leave it behind? Did he have a secret agenda? Suddenly, Teresa tripped over a branch and Mike went back to help her. Jonathan, however, ran further. Mike shouted at him, but he wouldn't listen. Then Mike and Teresa heard dogs barking. They felt like they had to get out of there, but their priority was to get out of the forest without getting harmed by what was chasing them. They felt like somebody was getting close. The barking was getting louder as well. Teresa hit herself and couldn't run any further. Mike got in front of Teresa. He wouldn't let anyone or anything hurt his wife. She was way too important for him. Then suddenly, the dog was called off, and a man approached them. Who was this mysterious man? The man asked them what they were doing there. Mike was relieved that he would just talk to them. He instantly felt a lot less scared and more relieved than anything. Apparently, the man's name was Peter, and he was the local forest ranger. Peter was investigating why there was a device active in this part of the forest, and he started asking a lot of questions. Teresa and Mike explained their reason for being here. They just stumbled upon the tiny house, and they did not have any intentions. They told Peter that Jonathan had taken the device with him. Peter saw on his tracking device that Jonathan was already close to the forest edge again. There was no way he or his dog could catch up to him. He invited Mike and Teresa to his cabin in the woods to explain everything. Peter told them that the tiny house was under surveillance, the exact reason he did not want to tell to them. The tiny house was a remnant of an amusement park that was closed years ago. As a ranger, it felt it was his duty to protect it. The device was a tracking device that he left there by accident the last time he visited. It was pretty costly, so he wanted to get it back. Jonathan was still missing. He had the device and thought he had found something extremely special. Teresa tried to call Jonathan to tell him what was going on, but he did not answer. It went straight to voicemail. They knew that Jonathan was really stubborn, so Peter asked if he could accompany them to explain the whole story to Jonathan. The group went back to the forest edge. They did not see any sign of Jonathan, but he must be here somewhere. Then they heard a voice in the distance. Jonathan approached them out of nowhere. He seemed glad that everyone was unharmed. He did not seem to have the device on him. Peter immediately asked him where the device was, but Jonathan did not seem intimidated by Peter. He did not want to give the location of the device up. Why was this so important to Jonathan? Finally that evening, Peter started telling the entire story. The house was under surveillance because of a rare species that was sighted there. Peter thought that he had made the discovery of his life and wanted to get to the bottom of what he had seen. He did not want anyone else claiming his discovery, which is why he left the device. Jonathan seemed a bit disappointed. He thought he had found something completely different. He then gave up the location where he had hidden the tracking device. He felt sorry for leaving Mike and Teresa behind in the forest. Together, they made a deal that they would leave Peter alone to claim his discovery. Eventually, they saw in the newspaper that Peter had made his discovery and that he thanked them for helping him.